Welcome to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe. It will be interesting. And we begin.
Story 1. The last flight. I never thought that one day I would become part of the headlines. Plane crashes always seemed like something distant, events that happened to other people but not to me. However, on August 15, 2019, my life changed forever. I had been working as a flight attendant for an international airline for over 10 years. That day, I was assigned to a flight from Paris to New York. Everything seemed routine. Passengers boarded the plane, smiling or tense, and took their seats. We conducted the standard safety briefing, and the plane smoothly ascended into the sky. An hour into the flight, we noticed a strange noise coming from the rear of the plane. At first, it was barely audible, a faint rattling, but over time, it grew louder. The pilots reassured us that everything was under control, but I noticed the co-pilot frequently leaving the cockpit to talk to the onboard mechanic. Suddenly, we felt a sharp drop. People in the cabin screamed. Some fell from their seats, and the plane began to shake uncontrollably. As chaos ensued, I saw the captain emerge from the cockpit, his face deathly pale. He shouted for everyone to prepare for an emergency landing. Our plane was losing altitude. I quickly moved through the cabin, ensuring passengers were strapped in. We were told they would attempt an emergency landing on water. My heart pounded, and my breath was uneven. I barely had time to glance out the window before we hit the water. Survival. The shock of the impact was overwhelming. Water immediately began to fill parts of the cabin, and I heard screams. My first thought was that we were all going to die, but those who remained conscious began to act. The plane split into two sections and ocean water gushed in. I struggled to unbuckle my seatbelt, my hands trembling. Passengers around me were screaming. Some had already climbed through gaps in the fuselage. I helped a woman who was trapped by her tangled seatbelt, and together we rushed toward the exit. Outside, darkness and turbulent waves awaited us. In the distance, pieces of the wing floated. We saw an inflatable raft already filling with survivors. I grabbed a yellow life jacket and swam toward the raft, helping those who couldn't swim on their own. Waves battered us, the water was freezing, and people panicked, searching for their loved ones. Some prayed, some cried. We had no idea if rescuers would find us. There was no radio signal, and we could only wait. Hours later, we saw lights on the horizon. It was a rescue helicopter. It approached, and we all started waving our arms, trying to get its attention. The moment I heard the sound of the rescue boat approaching was like being born again. They pulled us from the water, wrapped us in warm blankets, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt relief. Later, I learned that the crash was caused by a mechanical engine failure. Many people survived, but some never made it out. That was a day I will never forget. And although years have passed, every night, I still recall those terrifying moments in the dark ocean. But most importantly, I am alive, and now I cherish every second of my life. Story 2. Flight into the unknown. I have always loved traveling. I used to think the sky was the safest place on Earth. I had flown dozens of times and never considered that my next flight would be the most terrifying ordeal of my life. But on July 3, 2021, Flight 247 of Skywings, airlines from Singapore to Sydney, changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine night flight, one of those where you fall asleep on board and wake up in another country. I sat by the window in the middle section of the plane, admiring the night view of Singapore as it gradually disappeared into darkness. Passengers were chatting, some watching movies, others already putting on their sleep masks. The flight attendants conducted the standard safety briefing, and we ascended into the sky. About an hour after takeoff, I felt light turbulence, nothing alarming. But then the plane started shaking more violently. The pilot announced over the intercom that we were entering a strong turbulence zone. I fastened my seatbelt and tried to remain calm. Everything changed in seconds. First, We heard a loud metallic creak as if something had snapped in the plane's structure. Then came the sudden drop. The aircraft seemed to freefall through the air. The cabin filled with screams. Children cried. Some passengers recited prayers. Looking out the window, I saw one of the engines engulfed in flames. The red glow flickered in the night before a massive explosion. Metal debris flew through the air, some pieces striking the fuselage. The acrid smell of burning filled the cabin. The pilots declared an emergency and tried to regain control of the plane. Flight attendants rushed through the cabin, helping passengers. But the plane continued losing altitude. Suddenly, the rear emergency door burst open. I saw several people get sucked out into the night sky. It was the most horrifying sight I had ever witnessed. We began a rapid descent. The pilots announced they would attempt an emergency landing on a small island in the Pacific. But the plane was severely damaged, and the chances of a smooth landing were slim. When we hit the ground, the impact was so violent that I was flung forward despite my seatbelt. Fire spread quickly, and I had to get out. I don't know how many people escaped, but there weren't many of us. We left the wreckage and moved inland. There was no communication, and our food and water were limited. Several people were badly injured, and we had to improvise medical care with whatever remained from the plane. We spent 3 days on the island before rescuers found us. The distress signal that the pilots managed to send was our saving grace. When I saw the first helicopter, I nearly cried. It was true salvation. After the crash, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Nightmares haunted me every night. But I survived, and that was what mattered most. I never again took flying for granted. Every time I board a plane now, I remember those 3 days stranded in the middle of the ocean and how precious life truly is. Story 3. The Last Signal. No one expects to be part of a plane crash. No one buys a ticket thinking it might be their last flight. I never thought about it either when I boarded Flight 605 of Atlantic Air. But on March 12, 2017, that flight became the most terrifying experience of my life. I was flying from London to Toronto for business. It was a routine daytime flight. The plane, a Boeing 767, was large and reliable. There were about 200 passengers on board. I sat by the window watching Heathrow Airport fade into the distance. Everything was calm. We took off, and I relaxed, flipping through a magazine while sipping coffee. 3 hours into the flight, I heard a strange metallic noise. At first, I thought it was just a random sound, but then the Fasten seatbelt sign illuminated, and the captain announced over the intercom for everyone to remain seated. I looked out the window and saw one of the engines emitting strange smoke. Passengers began to murmur in concern. A burnt smell filled the cabin. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. A minute later, we felt a sharp drop. The plane tilted violently to one side. People screamed. Some were crying, others praying. Flight attendants tried to calm passengers, but their faces betrayed their fear. The captain announced that both engines had failed. We were over the Atlantic, and an emergency landing was inevitable. We were told to prepare for a water landing. When the plane hit the water, the impact was so powerful that I was thrown forward despite my seatbelt. Water began flooding into the cabin immediately. It was dark, cold, and filled with chaotic noise. I rushed to the emergency exit. A flight attendant was helping passengers escape. Some were tangled in their seatbelts. I grabbed a young woman's hand and pulled her free. We found ourselves in the open ocean. A few survivors clung to floating debris, trying to stay afloat. The cold was unbearable, and there was no sign of rescue on the horizon. Each minute felt like an eternity. We gathered near a life raft. Someone used a flashlight to signal. After a few hours, distant lights appeared. It was a rescue aircraft. When we were pulled onto the Coast Guard's boat, I was shaking from cold and fear. We had survived, but many had not. After this disaster, I couldn't sleep for weeks. The Atlantic, the panic, the impact. It all haunted my dreams. But I was alive, and that thought always reminded me how fragile life is. Story 4. Flight into Darkness. Life is a series of unpredictable events. We make plans for the future without realizing that one moment can change everything. On September 9th, 2022, I boarded Flight 308 of Andes Airways from Buenos Aires to Lima. It was supposed to be a routine flight, but it turned into a nightmare that left an indelible mark on my memory. Even at the airport, something felt off. The aircraft looked old. I overheard the crew discussing some technical checks. Still, we were eventually called to board, and we took off into the sky. I was seated in the second row by the aisle. The plane reached cruising altitude, and passengers relaxed. The flight attendants began serving drinks. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. About an hour into the flight, I heard a loud noise, as if something had exploded. The plane shook violently. I could feel it losing altitude. Passengers started screaming. The captain announced over the intercom that there was a serious emergency. One of the engines had failed, and the other was unstable. We were flying over the mountainous terrain of Peru, and the only option was to attempt an emergency landing. Chaos erupted in the cabin. Flight attendants tried to maintain order, but I could see the fear in their eyes. The aircraft continued descending rapidly. Through the window, I saw the mountains getting closer. Minutes later, the captain announced an emergency landing attempt in a narrow valley. We all fastened our seatbelts. I clenched my teeth and braced for impact. The landing was brutal. The plane skidded across the ground, and a wing was torn off. Debris flew everywhere. The cabin filled with smoke and dust. I heard screaming, but I forced myself to move. The cabin was in chaos. I helped people escape through the emergency exit. Many were injured, but we did our best to help each other. We found ourselves stranded in the wilderness, far from civilization. Some people were seriously injured, and there was no communication. We gathered the able-bodied survivors and set out to look for help. After 2 days, locals discovered us and alerted the rescuers. It felt like a second chance at life. I couldn't believe we had survived. After that flight, I realized that life should never be taken for granted. Every day is a gift. Those terrifying hours on the plane taught me to appreciate every moment.
Thanks for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe.